Donald Trump's latest statement, where he has said that after he's finished with Iran, he's going to consider US's position in NATO, is typical Donald Trump. And actually, it is exactly what Vladimir Putin would like Donald Trump to do, because he is helping behind closed doors to reinforce this split that there is between the United States and the European members of NATO. I include Canada as a European member of NATO. What has irked Donald Trump? It's the fact that his campaign into Iran has not been supported by many NATO countries. And in fact, NATO countries have put barriers in his way in many cases, including the United Kingdom. We've got the likes of Spain who are not allowing US flights to overfly, and other NATO countries. We've got the United Kingdom denied the United States use of a couple of strategic bases. And from a logic perspective, Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth have got a point. If we are providing bases in Europe to keep you secure, then we want to use those bases for our own purposes, and you deny us the ability to do that. Why should we keep you secure? This goes back to the fact that European nations and Canada have been relying on the United States for its defense for so many years, and effectively freeloading off the United States. But is the comment to withdraw from NATO and to tar everyone with the same brush justified? No, it's not, because NATO has provided security for the United States as much as the United States has provided security for other NATO contributing countries. So if the United States withdrew from NATO, would that be significant? The answer is yes, very significant indeed. Vladimir Putin would see that as a green light to increase his activities across Europe. He would see that as something saying that the United States is not interested in protecting European countries, or what is the United States' eastern flank. The North Atlantic is part of the United States area of interest. The Russians and Chinese are exploiting that, hence why Donald Trump was so vocal about Greenland and everything else. Could NATO work without the United States? Well, the United States brings a number of different things. A, the biggest budget in NATO. B, the big access to the biggest military on paper in NATO. We have to remember that that military is split between the continental United States, other US interests around the world, focusing on the North Atlantic, and we're talking about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Pacific, and the majority of the forces are Pacific focused. And that's where Donald Trump has been with what he's saying. But there's a number of things that the United States brings that other NATO countries can't easily replicate at the moment. And that includes intelligence access, it includes transport aircraft capability, it includes fighter and fighter bomber capability from a strategic perspective. The United States is a power projection force. It can pick up a big military capability, take it to somewhere in the world, and project that force on the ground and then reinforce it. There are very few other nations that can do that, and do that at the scale that the Americans can do. So NATO would lose enormously. Would it destroy NATO? No. There are already plans in NATO for operations should the United States decide it's not going to participate in those operations. And those plans have been in place for decades. I was a NATO planner. I have helped exercise those plans, and it's looking at the coming together of European nations and Canada, and potentially others coming in as a coalition of the willing to carry out operations without the overall US command and the levels of support that we'd expect from the US, and certainly no US troops as part of the ORBATs, the organizations that would go onto the ground to do anything. And that's been practiced. And the person that takes command of the Supreme Allied Headquarters then is the Deputy Supreme Commander, and that is a British officer. And it always was a British officer, A, to keep that bridge with the Americans going, but B, to have a European-focused alternative command and control structure in place, should the Americans decide they didn't want to play. And of course, we have to remember that during the First World War, the Americans came late to the party. During the Second World War, the Americans came very late to the party. So I think it's a bit wry of Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth to turn around and say that the Western nations are a little bit late to his war in Iran, especially when he won't have shared the detailed plans with many of them. he would have done with the United Kingdom had we not had that hiccup and Keir Starmer focus on policies that I can only work the logic behind them. He was looking at his cabinet and his backbenches rather than the international implications, and we're going to pay for that. Well, the first 12 months would be NATO nations without the United States then getting together and going, what's the delta? What is it that we can provide? What is it that the Americans will provide? What's essential for what's going on around the world at the moment? And how do we fill that gap? And therefore that will, and once you've worked out that from a collective perspective, it's then sitting down in front of all the different nations and saying, right, who is going to cough up the money to procure the equipment to fill that gap, or procure the personnel to fill that gap? And that's something that will take a lot of negotiations. NATO countries are very reluctant to stand up. What does that mean practically? It means practically that a number of nations are going to have to increase their defense budgets quite significantly, and change their procurement plans. And it will probably mean a specialization in different countries. So, for example, Poland and Germany are continental based. They do not necessarily need large navies. They've got access into the Baltic, but they don't need to have something that's necessarily globally deployable. So they could focus on heavy armor, for example, in the provision of that. The United Kingdom could then say, well, we're not going to focus on heavy armor. We'll focus on a deployable element, and therefore increase what we've got with our troop transport, with our ability to transport heavy equipment, with our maritime capability, and have our troops, our army focused on lighter weight, specialist intervention, special forces, something that can go and do something relatively quickly but relatively lightly. The French could operate somewhere in between, and therefore that's what the nations will be sitting down and trying to work out. Having done that sort of planning in NATO, and that's something that NATO does every time it goes on an operation. It works out. I've done a plan. We submit the plans, and different nations turn around and bid for what they can provide. We then look at what we still need and go back to nations and try and see what we can get. So it's something that NATO is really quite used to doing. Is it used to coming up with solutions that will give everything that you need? No, because they're tied in with politics in different countries, and the politics are extremely complex. And at the minute, we just need to look at the United Kingdom. Our government is turning around and saying that it is increasing its defence budget. It has increased the defence budget as a percentage of GDP, but the reality is that that is not translating into greater defence capability, because it's increased the defence budget, but it's put a number of other things in there that the defence budget are paying for. And they tend not to say that. And this is where we're getting politics being played by defence budgets. So the reality is, for our troops on the ground, they've actually got less money to spend for the next 2 or 3 years, and that's worrying. Getting a public message that shows NATO unity, if the United States decide to pull out, would be critical. Now, the discussions will be going on behind closed doors at the moment. There are a number of other different groupings within other NATO nations that have come together, and I think that would happen very, very quickly indeed. And that message of unity would send a clear message to Vladimir Putin. Turning that message of unity, turning the words into actual practical military capability in the ground, is something that would take quite some time. And that is the bit that would be most concerning, because that's the bit that the politicians interfere with. They're great at saying things. They're very bad when it comes to actually dipping their hands into their pockets and having to make those political decisions at home as to whether you're going to fund welfare or defense capability. And how do you do that balance between where is the global risk going against the global threats, and where's the political risk domestically? The last time we had to get into that position was probably at the sort of levels of threat that we're at the moment, was probably 1936 to 1938. Our politicians got it badly, badly wrong then. I'm seeing parallels today.